Chronicles, Chapter 1, The Kidnap. The sun rose lazily over the village of Brackenvale, casting long golden rays over rooftops of thatched straw and chimneys puffing wisps of sleepy smoke. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary morning. And by ordinary, I mean utterly unremarkable. This is where you'd skip ahead if you were flipping through pages looking for action. Don't worry, it's coming. Just not yet. Children's laughter rang out as they played by the well, and the air carried that warm, idyllic mix of baking bread and dew-drenched fields. Naturally, this tranquility couldn't last. Something dramatic was about to happen. It always does in villages like this. Juniper, a farm girl with calloused hands and a sharp wit, was busy herding sheep when the peace shattered. The baker, imagine a man whose apron does more running than he does, sprinted across the cobblestones, shouting, "The prince! Prince Olden has been taken!" Now, this sort of thing doesn't happen every day, even in a story like ours, and it caused quite the commotion. Gasps, gawking, you name it. But let's pause here to set the record straight. Juniper wasn't the sort of person who dreamt of rescuing royalty. Oh no, she'd rather rescue her flock from a particularly ornery goat, which, if you've met goats, is no small task. Still, Prince Olden wasn't your average prince. He was, how shall I put this, unexpectedly decent. Less crown, more commoner. Once he'd helped Juniper fix a broken cartwheel, and that moment of kindness stuck with her like a thorn in her otherwise practical mind. Before anyone could process the news, an elaborately dressed messenger galloped into the square, complete with a trumpet so shiny it probably had its own cleaning staff. He unfurled a scroll and declared, "By decree of King Edwin, a reward shall be granted to any brave soul who rescues Prince Olden. Riches beyond measure." Riches beyond measure. It's the kind of promise that sounds grand until you realize you can't actually measure it, and you start wondering if the king would shortchange you in gold bars. The crowd murmured, but, spoiler alert, no one volunteered. Brackenvale was peaceful, and the villagers had no appetite for the kind of danger that came with rescuing royalty. This is where Juniper surprised herself. "If no one else will go," she said, her voice louder than she intended, "I will." The crowd turned to her in astonishment, which is precisely what happens when a farm girl volunteers to do something wildly above her pay grade. "You?" the baker asked, his expression teetering between admiration and disbelief. "A farm girl?" "Why not?" Juniper replied, straightening her shoulders. "I've chased off wolves, scaled cliffs, and outwitted troublemakers. How different can rescuing a prince be?" "Well, Juniper, very. But let's not spoil the fun." And just like that, Juniper's quiet life took a sharp turn. She didn't know it yet, but her sheep-herding days were officially over. Chapter 2, The Reluctant Ally. The path from Brackenvale twisted and climbed into the foothills, where the trees crowded close like nosy neighbors peering over your fence. Now, if this were a story about a plucky farm girl enjoying a scenic hike, we'd linger here to describe the picturesque scenery. But it's not, so let's move on. Juniper tugged her cloak tighter against the highland wind, which seemed to have a personal grudge against travelers. Her boots crunched on the rocky trail, a sound that would have been soothing if it weren't for the eerie silence surrounding her. When she finally spotted the tower, she muttered under her breath, "Why do kidnappers always choose towers?" This is an excellent question. Towers are drafty, impractical, and generally hard to keep clean. But they do look dramatic, which is probably the point. The tower itself was exactly what you'd expect, crooked, moss-covered, and leaning just enough to make you question its structural integrity. A faint light flickered in a high window, because again, kidnappers love a bit of theatrical flair. Juniper approached cautiously, the heavy wooden door at the base creaking on its hinges. If you're imagining an ominous sound, congratulations, you've nailed it. Inside, The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and burnt wood. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars containing things no sane person would willingly label. "Who dares disturb my exile?" The voice came from the shadows and was, naturally, as dramatic as the setting. This is where most people would have bolted. Juniper, however, had her own brand of stubbornness. "I'm looking for the prince," she said, her voice steady. "Do you know anything about it?" The figure stepped into the candlelight, revealing a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a painting titled Tragic Hero in Decline. His once regal cloak was now tattered, and his boots, though sturdy, had seen better days. "And if I do?" "Then you tell me," Juniper replied, crossing her arms, "and I'll be on my way." He chuckled, a sound that was both humorless and vaguely sinister. "Bold for a farm girl. I haven't seen the prince, but I might know where he's been taken. The question is," he leaned in, his gaze sharp, "what's in it for me?" Here's where Juniper could have said something clever or bribed him with riches. Instead, she went with the truth. "The king's offering a reward," she said. "Riches beyond measure." "I've no use for riches," the man replied, waving a hand as if dismissing the concept entirely. "To be fair, you can't eat gold and it doesn't make for comfortable bedding. What I need is redemption." "Redemption," Juniper echoed, her brow furrowing. He sighed, gesturing to the cluttered room around them. "Once I was Thorn the Valiant, knight of the realm, hero of 100 battles. Now I'm a ghost hiding in this forsaken place because his voice cracked, failed. Thorn, as he would later insist Juniper call him, explained his predicament with the dramatic flair of someone who spends too much time alone. By the end of his monologue, Juniper had agreed to let him join her quest. Why? She wasn't entirely sure, but if nothing else, he looked capable with a sword. As they prepared to leave, a magpie swooped into the room and landed on Juniper's shoulder. "You'll want to take me with you," the bird said. Juniper blinked. "A talking bird?" "I'm Jax," the magpie announced, puffing out his chest. "And I know things, useful things. You'll need me." "A disgraced knight and a chatty magpie," Juniper muttered. "This keeps getting better." And with that, the odd trio set off into the wilderness, leaving behind the tower and any lingering doubts about whether this story could get any stranger. Chapter 3. The Ravine. By the time the trio reached the ravine, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the jagged cliffs. The path twisted sharply, the edges crumbling into an abyss that seemed to stretch forever. It was the sort of place that made you wonder why anyone would bother building a path there in the first place. Juniper peered over the edge, her boots kicking loose a pebble that disappeared into the mist below. "We're not jumping, that's for sure. Even if we did, the mist would swallow us," Jax said, ruffling his feathers nervously. "Not that I'm volunteering to find out." Thorn surveyed the ravine with a knight's practiced eye. "There." He pointed to a rope bridge swaying in the wind, its wooden planks creaking ominously. "That's our way across." Because of course it was. Juniper raised an eyebrow. Naturally. Why have a sturdy, safe bridge when we could have this death trap instead? As they approached, a low growl echoed through the ravine, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. A hulking figure emerged from the mist, its mottled green skin glistening like wet stone. It carried a massive staff adorned with carved runes, because even trolls like a bit of flair. "Who dares attempt to cross my bridge?" Now, fun fact about trolls, they're big on drama. This one had clearly been rehearsing his lines for years. Juniper glanced at Thorn, who instinctively reached for his sword. Jax, perched on her shoulder, whispered, "Don't insult him, trolls are sensitive." "I do," Juniper called out, stepping forward, "and I'd appreciate it if you didn't eat us." The troll tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Eat you? What do you take me for? A barbarian? I have refined tastes." For the record, the troll's idea of refined tastes included an alarming amount of pie, but we'll get to that later. You can't pass, the troll continued, unless you solve my challenge. Let me guess, Juniper said, crossing her arms. A riddle? The troll's lips curled into a grin. Not a riddle, a game. I've grown tired of riddles. They're so last century. Thorn frowned. What kind of game? The troll gestured with a dramatic flourish, and a stone table materialized from the mist. On it was a grid etched into the surface, filled with small stones in two colors, black and white. Checkers, the troll declared. Jax squawked in disbelief. You're kidding. I assure you, I'm not, the troll replied. Beat me at a game of checkers, and you may cross. Lose, and he let the implication hang ominously, which is troll speak, for you don't want to know. Now, if you've never played checkers with a troll, let me save you the trouble. Don't. They take it very seriously, and they're surprisingly good at it. Juniper sat across from the troll, her fingers hovering over the stones. I used to play this with my grandmother, she muttered. How hard can it be? Spoiler alert, very. The troll played with the precision of someone who had centuries to practice. Juniper's brow furrowed as she tried to anticipate his moves, but every time she thought she had him cornered, he'd pull some devious maneuver that left her scrambling. Block his king, Thorn advised. No, not that one, Jax chimed in. The other one. Because nothing improves a high-stakes game like conflicting advice. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, Juniper paused, her eyes narrowing as a plan formed. With a series of rapid moves, she cornered the troll's remaining pieces. The final capture was swift and decisive. The troll stared at the board, his glowing eyes wide with disbelief. Then, to everyone's surprise, he threw back his head and laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the ravine. Well played, little human, he said, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. You've bested me fairly. The bridge is yours. As the trio crossed the swaying rope bridge, the troll called after them, Next time you're in the area, bring pie. I've grown rather fond of it. Noted, Juniper replied, shaking her head as they reached the other side. I'm starting to think nothing about this journey will be normal, Thorn muttered. I could have told you that, Jax said with a flap of his wings. Juniper sighed, the bridge creaking behind them as the troll disappeared into the mist. Their path stretched ahead, fraught with the promise of more challenges. Chapter 4, The Marshlands of Gloom. The rope bridge creaked and swayed under their weight, but they crossed safely, barely. If the bridge had feelings, it would probably have protested being asked to carry anyone heavier than a magpie, let alone a knight in armor. On the other side, the air seemed heavier. The warmth of the village and the crisp winds of the highlands were gone, replaced by something unpleasant. Ahead lay the Marshlands of Gloom. Dramatic name, isn't it? I assure you, it's every bit as terrible as it sounds. The smell hit them first, a pungent mix of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and something faintly metallic. Imagine leaving a bucket of pond water in the sun for a month, then adding a dash of despair. That's the marsh. Charming, Jax muttered, fluffing his feathers. Thorn surveyed the landscape with a frown. We'll need to stick close. It's easy to lose your way in marshes like these. And what happens if we do? Juniper asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Let's just say the marsh has a reputation for swallowing travelers whole, Thorn replied grimly. Juniper tightened her grip on her satchel. Great. Let's not test that reputation, then. Into the marshlands. The marsh was every bit as unpleasant as advertised. Mud sucked at their boots with every step, and the mist seemed to have a mind of its own, swirling to obscure their path whenever they thought they'd found solid ground. Stay alert, Thorn warned. The marsh is full of creatures that don't like visitors. Wonderful, Juniper muttered. Dark shapes loomed in the distance, trees twisted into grotesque forms, their branches like skeletal hands. Somewhere in the mist, A low croaking sound echoed, followed by the distant splash of water. "What was that?" Juniper whispered. "Probably just a frog," Jack said, though his voice was unusually high-pitched. "Or something bigger," Thorn added, because he had a talent for making bad situations sound worse. They trudged deeper, eventually coming to a stretch of water dotted with small moss-covered islands. The only way forward was to hop from one to the next. "Careful," Thorn said, testing the first island with his foot. "Some of these might not be as solid as they look." As if on cue, the first island wobbled precariously. Jax, wisely deciding to avoid the ordeal, flew overhead. Halfway across, a loud plop broke the silence. Juniper froze, her heart pounding. "Tell me that was just another frog," she said. "Not likely," replied Thorn, drawing his sword. The water rippled ominously, then erupted as a massive creature burst forth. It had the body of an eel, the claws of a crab, and too many eyes to count. The bog worm. Thorn gritted his teeth. "A bog worm. Keep moving." "Faster than what?" Jax squawked, swooping out of the worm's reach. "That thing has more teeth than common sense." The worm lunged, its claws snapping inches from Juniper as she leapt to the next island. Thorn swung his sword, deflecting a strike from the creature's tail. "Over here, slime face!" Jax taunted, diving at the worm's eyes. His aerial assault bought the group precious seconds. "Move!" Thorn shouted, slicing through a tangle of vines as they reached the far side of the marsh. Juniper turned just in time to see the worm crash into a patch of unstable islands, sinking into the muck with a furious hiss. "Good riddance," Jax muttered, perching on a nearby branch. That thing had terrible manners. The discovery. Breathless and muddy, the group stumbled into a clearing where the mist parted, revealing a stone altar overgrown with moss. At its center was a golden orb, glowing faintly. "What's that?" Juniper asked, approaching cautiously. "A locator orb," Thorn said, his voice tinged with awe. "It's used to track people or objects of great importance." Jax flitted down to perch on the altar. "So it can lead us to the prince?" "Exactly," Thorn replied. The moment his fingers touched the orb, its glow brightened and an image appeared within, a shadowy fortress surrounded by jagged peaks. "That's the Black Keep," Thorn murmured. "No one's been there in years. It's said to be cursed." "Of course it is," Juniper said dryly, "because nothing on this quest can be simple." Despite her sarcasm, a flicker of determination lit her eyes. They had a lead now, and no matter how dangerous the path ahead, she wasn't about to turn back.